My name is Stella Kellner and I was 34 years old the year I found out that a signature on a piece of paper can either protect someone or destroy them, depending entirely on who holds the pen. I didn't go looking for the truth that summer. The truth came looking for me the way it always does when someone in a family decides they're smart enough to get away with something and just barely isn't. What I didn't know then, what none of us knew, was that the person I was trying to protect had already spent 6 quiet months protecting herself. This is the story of how I found out and what happened when I did. My grandmother, Eleanor Kellner, turned 82 on a Wednesday in July. She lived alone in the same white clapboard house on Rich Patch Road in Covington, Virginia that she had lived in since 1971. The house sat on just under half an acre at the edge of town where the Allegheny Mountains started to rise in the distance like a promise nobody had broken yet. She had a front porch with a wooden swing she'd painted blue every 3 years without fail, a vegetable garden along the south side of the house that produced more tomatoes than one woman could possibly eat, and a kitchen that smelled permanently of coffee and cedar from the chest she kept by the back door. She had planted a dogwood tree in the front yard the spring my father was born, and it had grown so wide over the decades that it shaded the entire porch by afternoon. Eleanor Kellner was not a soft woman. She was sharp in the way that people who have survived real things become sharp, not cruel, just precise. She noticed everything. She remembered the names of your friends from 5 years ago and the exact words you'd used the last time you'd made an excuse not to visit. She kept her finances in a leather ledger by hand because she didn't trust computers, and she paid every bill on the day it arrived, never the day it was due. People in Covington knew her. Not in a famous way, just in the way that certain people become part of the texture of a town, so woven in that you stop noticing them until the day they're gone and suddenly everything looks different. I was the granddaughter who showed up. That is the simplest way I know to put it. I drove the 2 hours from Roanoke on birthdays, on holidays, sometimes on random Saturdays in October just because the drive through the Allegheny Highlands was beautiful and Eleanor always had coffee ready like she'd been expecting me. I was not the favorite grandchild. That distinction belonged to my cousin Marcus, my Aunt Greta's son, who was handsome in the way that mediocre men sometimes are and charming in the way that dangerous ones always are. Marcus got the birthday cards with checks in them. I got the ones with handwritten notes that were worth considerably more, though I didn't fully understand that until much later. I should tell you about Greta. Greta Kellner was my father's older sister, Eleanor's daughter, and the kind of woman who could turn any room into a transaction within 10 minutes of entering it. She had been married twice, divorced twice, and somewhere between the two had developed a talent for identifying what people owned and calculating how it might benefit her. She managed a small property rental business out of Harrisonburg and had strong opinions about real estate values, market timing, and what constituted a reasonable use of an elderly woman's assets. She used phrases like responsible transition planning and family equity management the way other people used grace at the dinner table, reflexively without thinking, as if the words themselves made the thing holy. My father, James, was the quieter of the two siblings. Not gentle, just conflict-averse, which is a different thing entirely. He deferred to Greta on most things because deferring was easier than deciding, and he had been doing it since they were children sharing a bedroom in the same house on Rich Patch Road that Eleanor still called home. He was not a bad man. He was the kind of man who lets bad things happen by looking slightly to the left of them while telling himself he had no choice. And then there was me. Stella Kellner, paralegal at a small civil litigation firm in Roanoke, 34 years old, owner of a reliable sedan and an apartment with good light and not much furniture. I was the one in the family who read documents before signing them, who kept copies of things, who asked follow-up questions at the exact moment everyone else had decided the conversation was over. My aunt called me exhausting. My father called me thorough. Eleanor called me the careful one, and the way she said it, quiet and certain, like it was the best thing a person could be, always made me stand a little straighter. If you've ever been the person in your family who pays attention while everyone else performs, this story is going to feel very familiar. Stay with me because what Eleanor did before any of us knew to be worried is the part that still takes my breath away. The stories like this one hit close to home. Subscribe and stay with this channel because we are only at the very beginning, and you're going to want to be here for every single part of what comes next. The birthday in July started like any other. I arrived at the house on Rich Patch Road at noon with a lemon pound cake from the bakery on Main Street and a bouquet of sunflowers from the farmer's market because Eleanor had once mentioned offhand that she found roses performative. The porch swing was freshly painted, same blue it had always been. The tomato plants along the south wall were staked and heavy with fruit. Everything looked exactly the way it always looked, which was the first thing that should have told me something was wrong, because when people are planning to take something from you, they get very good at making the surface look undisturbed. Eleanor met me at the door in a yellow linen blouse and her good earrings, the small pearl drops she wore when she wanted to feel like herself. She looked well. She was thinner than I remembered from Easter, and there was something careful about the way she moved through the kitchen, like she was conserving something, energy or time or both. But her eyes were clear and her grip was firm when she took the cake box from me and set it on the counter with the efficiency of a woman who had been receiving guests in this kitchen for 50 years. We ate lunch on the porch. Chicken salad she'd made that morning, sliced tomatoes from the garden, sweet tea in the glasses with the faded blue rims she'd had since before my father was born. We talked about the heat, about my job, about the novel she was reading, about the family of cardinals that had taken up residence in the dogwood tree by the fence. It was ordinary and warm and exactly what I needed without knowing I needed it. Eleanor had a way of making an afternoon feel like something worth keeping, like a pressed flower slipped between the pages of a book you knew you'd come back to. It was after lunch, when I was washing dishes at the sink and Eleanor was deadheading the tomato plants through the open window, that I noticed the notepad on the counter beside the telephone. Eleanor kept a notepad there for grocery lists and phone messages, a habit so fixed it had become part of the kitchen's architecture. But the top sheet had been torn off recently enough that the impression of the writing from the removed page was still visible on the sheet beneath. I wasn't trying to read it. I was just standing there with wet hands and the afternoon light coming through the window at exactly the right angle. The impression read, Kellner Property Appraisal confirmed Thursday, Hargrove Realty, ask for Dawn. I dried my hands. I put the dish towel back on the rack. I walked out to the porch and sat back down in my chair and looked at Eleanor moving through her garden with her clippers, unhurried, precise, cutting exactly what needed to go and leaving everything else alone. She didn't look up. I didn't say anything. But something in my chest had shifted, the way a drawer shifts when it's been opened and not quite closed back the way it was. I told myself it was nothing. People got appraisals for all kinds of reasons. Insurance updates, estate planning, simple curiosity about what a house was worth after 50 years. I told myself that on the drive back to Roanoke. I told myself that again when I got home and made dinner and watched 2 episodes of something I can't remember. I almost believed it by the time I went to bed. Then my phone buzzed at 11:14 that night. A text from my cousin Marcus. Just checking in on Gran. How'd she seem today? Normal question. Reasonable question. Except Marcus had not voluntarily checked on Eleanor in 3 years. Not at Easter, not at Christmas, not on her 81st birthday when I'd sent a group text to the whole family reminding them of the date and received exactly 0 responses. Marcus didn't check in. Marcus showed up when there was something to collect. I stared at that text for a long time in the dark of my bedroom. I thought about the appraisal note. I thought about Greta and her property business and her comfortable language about equity management. I thought about the way Eleanor had moved through her kitchen that afternoon, careful and deliberate, like someone making sure everything was exactly where it should be before a storm rolled in. I thought about the pearl earrings she only wore when she wanted to feel like herself, and I wondered for the first time whether she had worn them that day not for the birthday but for something else entirely. Something she wasn't ready to tell me yet. I put the phone face down on the nightstand without responding. I didn't sleep well that night. And by morning I had already decided I was going to start paying very close attention to everything because someone clearly already was. I drove back to Covington 4 days later. I didn't tell anyone I was going. I left Roanoke early before the commuter traffic thickened on 81, and took the slower route through Clifton Forge just to give myself time to think. I had spent those 4 days doing what I always did when something felt wrong but I couldn't name it yet. I made a list. Not on paper, just in my head, running it over and over the way you run your tongue over a loose tooth. The appraisal note. Marcus's text. Greta's silence at Easter when Eleanor had mentioned wanting to repaint the back bedroom. The way my father had changed the subject. Small things. Individually meaningless. Together they had the shape of something I recognized from work, from the cases that came through our firm where the damage was already done by the time anyone thought to look. Eleanor was in the garden when I pulled up. She saw my car and straightened slowly, one hand on the small of her back, and watched me walk up the path with an expression I couldn't quite read. Not surprise. Not quite relief either. Something in between, like she'd been waiting but hadn't known exactly when. I brought coffee from the place on Maple Street she liked, the one that still used paper cups with the brown sleeves. We sat on the porch and she didn't ask why I'd come back so soon and I didn't explain. We just sat there for a while with the mountains in the distance and the cardinals making noise in the dogwood and the kind of quiet between two people who have never needed to fill it. After a while I asked her, as carefully as I knew how, whether anyone had spoken to her recently about the house. She looked at her coffee cup. She turned it slowly in both hands the way she did when she was choosing her words. Greta called last week, she said. She said she had found a place in Staunton. Independent living. Very nice, she said. Garden views. I waited. Eleanor looked up. She said the house was too much for one person and that the responsible thing would be to let it go while the market was still favorable. She said it the way Greta says everything. Like it had already been decided and she was just informing me of the outcome. I asked Eleanor what she had said back. She smiled, small and dry. I told her I would think about it. That was the answer I gave. Then I asked her about the appraisal from Hargrove Realty. The smile didn't change but something behind her eyes did. She was quiet for a moment. That one I didn't ask for, she said. Don Hargrove knocked on my door 3 weeks ago. Said he was in the neighborhood. Said he'd heard the property might be coming available and wanted to introduce himself. I asked him who told him that. She paused. He said a family member had reached out. I set my coffee down. Kept my voice even. Did he leave anything? A card. A packet. She stood up without hurrying and went inside and came back with a manila envelope that had been sitting, I noticed, not in a drawer or a pile, but on the shelf by the door where she kept things she hadn't decided what to do with yet. Inside was a comparative market analysis on Hargrove Realty letterhead. The Kellner property at Rich Patch Road. Estimated market value $640,000. Suggested listing price $590,000, noted as competitive for a quick close. Paperclipped to the back was a buyer interest letter from something called Ridgeline Property Solutions LLC. Cash offer. 30-day close. The contact on the buyer's side was a name I didn't recognize. The contact listed as the seller's representative was Greta Kellner. I read that line twice. I looked up at Eleanor. She was watching me with those clear, careful eyes. You're not surprised, I said. It wasn't a question. She shook her head slowly. I am old, Stella. I'm not confused. There is a difference. She reached over and took the envelope back from me and held it in her lap. I have been watching Greta watch this house for 15 years. Every time she visits, she walks the rooms differently than other people do. She looks at the ceilings. She opens the closets. She talks about the neighborhood values the way you talk about something you already own. I knew this was coming. I just didn't know it would come this fast. I asked her the question I needed to ask. Had she signed anything? She looked at me steadily. No. Not yet. She let that last word sit in the air between us. I felt the edge in it. Not yet meant there had been pressure. Not yet meant there would be more. I drove back to Roanoke that afternoon with the market analysis photographed on my phone and a sick feeling in my stomach that had nothing to do with the winding road. I pulled up Ridgeline Property Solutions LLC on my laptop that night. It had been registered with the Virginia State Corporation Commission 14 months ago. The registered agent was a man named Carl Binney, an attorney out of Waynesboro. The listed business address was a suite in a shared office building. The managing member on the formation documents was listed simply as GK Holdings, and GK Holdings had the same registered agent, the same address, and had been formed 11 days before Ridgeline. I am a paralegal. I read documents for a living. I know what a shell company looks like and I know why people build them, and the reason is almost never a good one. I called my father the next morning. I kept it simple. I told him I knew about the appraisal and the buyer letter. I told him I knew Greta was listed as the seller's representative. There was a long pause on his end, the kind that isn't silent so much as the sound of a person deciding how much to admit. Stella, he said finally. Greta is trying to help. Mom can't manage that property forever and the maintenance costs alone are going to eat through her savings. I asked him if Eleanor knew the full details of what was being arranged. He said she had been informed of the general plan. I asked him if that was the same as consenting to it. Another pause. Greta says Mom agreed in principle, he said. I asked him what in principle meant when it came to someone's home of 50 years. He didn't answer that. What he said instead was the thing that stayed with me. He said, Stella, Greta has power of attorney. She can handle this whether your grandmother agrees or not. I went very still. When I asked, when did that happen? He said Greta had handled the paperwork back in the spring. Eleanor had signed it in April. I asked him if he had been there when she signed. He said no. I asked if there had been a lawyer present. He said he didn't know. I asked if Eleanor had ever mentioned it to him directly or if he had only heard about it from Greta. The pause this time was the longest yet. He said I assumed Greta handled it properly. I hung up and sat at my kitchen table for a long time. Power of attorney. If that was real, if Eleanor had genuinely signed authority over her financial decisions to Greta in April, then the house could be sold without Eleanor's ongoing consent, and there would be very little standing in the way. But something about it didn't sit right. I had been to see Eleanor in May, 6 weeks after the supposed signing. She had been sharp, present, completely oriented. She had complained about the property tax assessment and quoted me the figure from memory. She had asked after my colleague by name, a colleague she had met exactly once 18 months before. That was not a woman who had just handed over control of her finances to someone else and forgotten to mention it. I pulled up the Virginia State Bar's online directory and searched for attorneys in the Covington and Staunton area who specialized in elder law. I wrote down 4 names. Then I opened a new document on my laptop and started writing down everything I knew in the order I knew it. The appraisal visit. The buyer letter. The shell company. My father's admission about the power of attorney. The timeline. The gaps. I am a paralegal. I had spent 6 years watching attorneys build cases out of exactly this kind of material, individual facts that meant little on their own and everything together. I knew what this looked like when it was laid out flat on a table. I also knew what it meant if that power of attorney was legitimate, and I knew what it would mean if it wasn't. That night I texted Eleanor. Not about any of it. Just thinking about you. The dogwood looked beautiful last week. She texted back 40 minutes later in her slow, deliberate way, 1 word at a time the way she always typed. Good. Come back soon. I have something to show you. Bring the good coffee. I stared at that message for a long time. I have something to show you. Eleanor Kellner did not say things like that casually. She was not a woman who used words as filler. If she had something to show me, it was because she had been waiting for the right moment and had decided the moment had arrived. I didn't know yet what was in that envelope or that box or wherever she had put the thing she wanted me to see. But I knew Eleanor. And I knew that when she said she had something to show you, she meant she had been holding it carefully, keeping it safe, waiting for someone she trusted to hand it to. I booked the next Saturday off work before I went to sleep. Saturday came with low clouds and the smell of rain that never arrived. I pulled into the Rich Patch Road driveway at 10:30 with 2 coffees and the 4 names of elder law attorneys still saved in my phone. Eleanor was not in the garden. The porch swing was still. The front door was unlocked, which it always was during the day, and when I stepped inside I found her at the kitchen table, not reading, not doing her crossword, just sitting with her hands folded on top of a wooden box I had never seen before. It was about the size of a shoebox, dark walnut stain, the kind of thing you'd find at an estate sale and recognize immediately as something a person had kept for a long time on purpose. She looked up when I came in and her expression was the one I had been turning over in my mind all week. Not worried. Not relieved. Settled. Like a woman who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had finally decided to set it down in the right place. Sit down, she said. I sat. She pushed one of the coffees toward herself without looking at the cup. I brought her the one from Maple Street, the one she liked, and she wrapped both hands around it and looked at me over the rim the way she did when she was about to say something she had rehearsed. I need to tell you something I should have told you 6 months ago, she said. Almost did. Several times. But I wasn't sure it had worked yet and I didn't want to worry you before I knew it was solid. She lifted the lid of the walnut box. Inside, arranged in a neat stack with a binder clip, were documents. Legal documents. I recognized the format immediately from my work, the weight of the paper, the notary stamps, the witnessing signatures running down the margin. She slid the stack across the table to me and I picked it up and started reading, and by the 3rd page I had to set my coffee down because my hands needed to be steadier than they were. 14 months ago, Eleanor had driven herself to an attorney's office in Lexington, a 40-minute drive she had made alone without telling a single member of our family. The attorney's name was Patricia Odom, a solo practitioner who had been doing estate planning and elder law in the Rockbridge County area for 23 years. Eleanor had called her cold from the phone book, made an appointment, and walked in carrying her original deed, her tax records, and a handwritten list of questions on yellow notepad paper. She had told Patricia Odom exactly what she was afraid of. She had said, "My daughter is going to try to sell my house the moment she believes she can do it without my permission. I want to make sure she cannot." What Patricia Odom had built for her over the following 2 weeks was clean and thorough, and as far as I could tell reading it at Eleanor's kitchen table, nearly airtight. First, a revocable living trust. Eleanor had transferred the deed of the Rich Patch Road property into the Eleanor M. Kellner Revocable Living Trust dated 14 months prior. The house no longer existed in Eleanor's individual name. It belonged to the trust. Eleanor was the trustee while she had capacity. I was named as the successor trustee. Not my father. Not Greta. Me. Second, a durable power of attorney naming me as Eleanor's agent for all financial and healthcare decisions, executed the same day as the trust, notarized, witnessed by 2 people who were not family members, and drafted with a durability clause that meant it did not expire if Eleanor became incapacitated. It activated. Third, a letter from Eleanor's physician, Dr. Carol Sutton at Allegheny Health, dated the same week as the signing, confirming that Eleanor had presented to her office and undergone a cognitive evaluation, that she was oriented to time, place, and person, that she demonstrated full understanding of the legal instruments she intended to sign, and that in Dr. Sutton's professional opinion she had complete testamentary capacity at the time of execution. I set the documents down. I looked at Eleanor. She was watching me with an expression I can only describe as patient. "You did all of this 14 months ago," I said. She nodded. Before anyone in the family had said a word about selling. Before the appraisal visit. Before Greta's phone call about the place in Staunton. She nodded again. "How did you know?" I asked. "How did you know it was coming?" She looked at her coffee. She looked out the window at the garden and was quiet for a moment. "Because I know Greta," she said simply. "And because last December I found a voicemail she left your father that she didn't know I'd heard. She had borrowed my phone to call him when hers died on Christmas and she forgot to delete it afterward. She said, 'James, the Rich Patch property is worth more than either of us realized. We need to move on this before Mom starts needing real care and it gets complicated. Move on this.'" That was what she said. Like the house was a position on a board game and Eleanor was just an obstacle between Greta and the next move. I sat back in my chair. Outside, the rain that had been threatening all morning finally decided to arrive, tapping quietly against the kitchen window. I thought about April, about the power of attorney my father had told me Greta possessed, about the supposed signing he hadn't witnessed and couldn't confirm. I told Eleanor what my father had said. I watched her face carefully. She didn't flinch. She didn't look surprised. She looked tired in a specific way, the way you look when something you predicted came true and you wish it hadn't. "I never signed anything for Greta willingly," she said. "Not in April. Not ever. Whatever document she has with my name on it, I did not sign it with full understanding of what it was." She paused and looked at her hands. "In April I had a bad week. My hip was bothering me badly enough that I wasn't sleeping. Greta came to visit and she was helpful and attentive and I was grateful for the company. She brought soup. She stayed 2 nights. She had me sign several things she said were routine. Insurance updates, she said. A form for the doctor's office. I signed because I was exhausted and she was being so kind and I made the mistake of trusting her more than I should have. She met my eyes. I believe one of those papers was not what she said it was. The room was very quiet except for the rain. I looked at the documents from Patricia Odom's office, at the trust executed 14 months ago, at Eleanor's signature on the originals, strong and deliberate, the capital E with its clean horizontal bars, the loop on the L, the careful spacing between each letter. Then I thought about what a signature executed during a week of pain and exhaustion and misplaced trust might look like next to this one. I already knew the answer before I found it. I asked Eleanor if she still had anything Greta had given her to sign in April. Anything at all. She thought for a moment, then went to the small desk in the corner of the living room where she kept her filing folders in a wire rack. She came back with a manila folder and spread its contents on the table between us. There were 3 documents. The first was genuinely an insurance form, routine. The second was a Medicare supplemental coverage update, also straightforward. The third was a single page I recognized the moment I unfolded it. A durable power of attorney, printed on plain paper with no attorney letterhead, Eleanor's name filled in as the principal and Greta Kellner's name filled in as the agent for all financial and property decisions. Signed at the bottom in a hand that was close to Eleanor's but not right. Lighter pen pressure. The capital E less defined than usual. The spacing between letters slightly wider, as though the hand had been moving more carefully than naturally, as though whoever signed had been copying a model rather than writing from memory and habit. I photographed every page on my phone without saying anything. The originals from Patricia Odom's folder and the April documents side by side, and then both sets together in a single frame that showed the two signatures at the same time. Then I called Patricia Odom's office from the kitchen and left a message asking for a call back as soon as possible, telling the receptionist it was time-sensitive and related to an active trust matter. Eleanor watched me do all of this without speaking. When I put my phone down, she reached across the table and covered my hand with hers. Her grip was thin but deliberate, the grip of someone who had made a decision and was not going back on it. "I chose you 14 months ago," she said. "I chose you because you read things carefully. Because you keep copies of what matters. Because you ask the questions nobody else is willing to ask." She paused and looked at me steadily. "I need you to ask them now." I turned my hand over and held hers. "I will," I said. I looked at the two signatures side by side on the table, one that was hers and one that had been constructed to look like it, and something settled in me that was colder and more focused than anger. I knew what the documents said. I knew what the differences meant. And I was beginning to understand with complete clarity exactly how deliberate this had been and how long it had been in the planning. The question now was not whether I was going to do something about it. The question was how fast I could move before Greta did. Patricia Odom called me back on Monday morning at 7:52. I was still in my car in the parking garage at work, engine off, coffee going cold in the cup holder when my phone rang with a Lexington area code. Her voice was measured and unhurried. The voice of someone who had heard a great many urgent situations and had learned that urgency itself solved nothing. I told her everything in the order it had happened. The appraisal visit. The buyer letter. The shell company. My father's admission about the April power of attorney. The 3 documents Eleanor had kept in the filing drawer. The signature that didn't look right. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished she was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. Then she said, "Bring me the originals. Everything from the walnut box and everything from that filing folder. Come this week if you can. Come tomorrow if you can manage it." I went back to Covington that evening after work. I told Eleanor I needed the documents, all of them, to take to Patricia's office. She went to the walnut box without hesitation and handed me the entire stack. Then she went to the filing drawer and retrieved the manila folder with the April papers. She held them out to me and then didn't let go for just a moment, not out of reluctance, just the way you hold something before you hand it to the person you've decided to trust with it. Then she let go. "Take care of those," she said. I drove to Lexington the next morning before work and sat across from Patricia Odom in a small office lined floor to ceiling with filing cabinets and left every document on her desk. Patricia called me Thursday afternoon. She had reviewed everything and her assessment was direct. The trust was valid and recorded. The durable power of attorney naming me predated the April document by 14 months and was properly executed with independent witnesses and a notary. The April power of attorney naming Greta had no attorney involvement, no independent witnesses, no capacity evaluation attached, and the signature presented characteristics consistent with either signing under duress or signing without full understanding of the document's content. She used the phrase characteristics consistent with carefully, the way attorneys use careful language when they mean something definitive but want the record to show they were precise. She said she wanted to refer the signature comparison to a forensic document examiner she had worked with before, a retired state police analyst named Howard Deeks who now consulted privately out of Roanoke. She said the comparison between the trust documents and the April power of attorney would give them something concrete to work with if this went further. I said whatever it takes. She said she would be in touch by the end of the week. What I didn't know while Patricia was reviewing documents in Lexington was that Greta had already moved. I found out from my father not because he told me willingly but because he called me that Thursday evening sounding rattled in a way I had never heard from him before, the kind of rattled that happens when someone who avoids confrontation gets caught between two people who aren't avoiding it at all. "Greta knows you've been to see an attorney," he said. I asked him how. He said Marcus had driven past Patricia Odom's office Tuesday morning and seen my car. I almost laughed. Marcus, who hadn't checked on his grandmother in 3 years, was apparently now monitoring parking lots in Lexington. My father said Greta was angry. He said she was talking about moving the closing date up. The original timeline had been set for 6 weeks out. Now she wanted it done in 3. She had called Don Hargrove at the realty office that afternoon and told him to contact the buyer and push for an accelerated close. My father's voice when he told me this had a particular quality I recognized from my childhood. The quality of a man who knew something wrong was happening and was telling me about it not because he intended to stop it but because he needed someone else to know so he could feel less alone in his knowledge. I thanked him for telling me. I hung up and called Patricia. She picked up on the second ring. I told her about the accelerated timeline. She said then we move faster too. She had already reached Howard Deeks. He had agreed to expedite the examination. She wanted to file a notice with the Allegheny County Circuit Court clerk by the end of the following week, a formal challenge to the validity of the April power of attorney, citing the pre-existing trust documentation, the capacity question and the signature irregularities. She said the filing itself would not stop the closing automatically, but it would create a cloud on the title that no reputable title company would ignore. She said if we could get Howard's report before the filing, the challenge would be considerably stronger. 3 days later I was back in Covington for a reason that had nothing to do with documents. Eleanor had called me on a Wednesday afternoon, not about the house or Greta or any of it, just to tell me that the last of the summer tomatoes were ready and she'd made sauce and there was a jar with my name on it. I drove out after work and we ate dinner at the kitchen table, pasta with her sauce and bread she'd bought from the church bakery, and she told me about the novel she'd just finished and the one she planned to start next and the argument she'd had with her neighbor about the property line by the fence that had been ongoing for 11 years and showed no signs of resolution. It was completely ordinary and I needed it badly. What I didn't need was what happened at 8 o'clock when Marcus knocked on the front door. He came in without being invited, which was consistent with every visit I could remember. He was wearing a collared shirt with the sleeves rolled up in the way that people do when they want to look like they've been working. He saw me at the kitchen table and his expression moved through surprise into something carefully composed in about a second and a half. Still, didn't know you'd be here. I'll bet, I said. Eleanor watched him from her chair with the focused stillness of a woman who had already decided how she felt about this visit. He sat down at the table without being asked, which Eleanor had once told me was the clearest indicator of whether a person had been raised with manners. He put a folder on the table. Gran, he said, his voice shifting into a register I recognized as his performing warmth voice. I just came to go over a few things with you. Straightforward stuff. Just needs your signature. I put my hand flat on top of the folder before he could open it. Marcus looked at me. I looked at him. Eleanor picked up her water glass and took a sip and set it back down. Whatever is in that folder, I said, is not going to be signed tonight or any other night without Eleanor's attorney present. Marcus's performing warmth dropped one register. Come on, Stella. This is a family matter. I kept my hand where it was. Which attorney does Eleanor have? He asked with the particular edge of someone who already knows the answer and doesn't like it. Patricia Odom, I said. Out of Lexington. His jaw tightened just slightly the way it had when we were teenagers and I'd caught him in something. He picked the folder back up off the table from under my hand and stood. Mom's going to hear about this, he said. He meant Greta. He walked out and left the front door open behind him. Eleanor got up and closed it. She came back to the table and sat down and finished her water. Then she looked at me. He's done that twice before, she said. Brought papers at night. Once when I had a headache and once when my friend Dorothy was visiting and I signed something to get him to leave. He said it plainly without drama. I asked her what she had signed. She said she didn't know. She said it looked like a property-related form but the print was small and she'd been embarrassed to ask him to wait while she read it. I kept my voice steady. Do you still have a copy? She went back to the filing drawer. There it was, a document I hadn't seen before. A listing authorization granting Greta Kellner the authority to act as Eleanor's representative in the sale of the Rich Patch Road property. Signed in Eleanor's hand but dated only 9 days ago. 9 days ago Eleanor had been sharp and well and entirely herself. And she had signed this because a family member had handed it to her at night and made her feel that asking questions was an imposition. I photographed it. I texted the image to Patricia at 9:15 that evening with a message that said, "New document 9 days old, listing authorization, obtained under pressure, no attorney present." She replied within 10 minutes. Forward the original by courier tomorrow. I will include it in the filing. This changes the timeline. I'll call you in the morning. I sat at Eleanor's kitchen table after she'd gone to bed and looked at the photographs on my phone. The trust. The legitimate power of attorney. The April forgery. The listing authorization obtained 9 days ago from a woman who had been too polite to push back. I thought about what Marcus had said on his way out. Mom's going to hear about this. I thought about Greta in Harrisonburg running her numbers, moving her timeline up, sending her son to collect signatures at night. I thought about the house around me, the smell of cedar and tomato sauce and 50 years of a life being lived with intention. I thought about Eleanor in the next room, asleep, her breathing slow and even. She had built a wall around this house 14 months ago. Greta had been trying to find the door ever since. What Greta didn't know yet was that there was no door. There was only the wall. And I was standing on the inside of it. Howard Deeks delivered his report on a Friday afternoon, 8 days before the closing. Patricia called me while I was eating lunch at my desk and read me the key finding without preamble. The signature on the April power of attorney, she said, showed statistically significant differences from the authenticated exemplars taken from Eleanor's trust documents in 15 measurable characteristics. Pen pressure, letter formation, baseline consistency, stroke sequencing. Howard had concluded with professional certainty that the April signature was either produced under conditions of significant physical or cognitive impairment or was not produced by the same hand at all. He would not go further than that in writing because that was the line between document examination and criminal allegation, but the report said everything it needed to say. Patricia had filed the formal challenge with the Allegheny County Circuit Court that same morning. The cloud on the title was now a matter of public record. The closing was set for the following Thursday at Blue Ridge Settlement Services on Jackson River Road in Covington, 2:30 in the afternoon, conference room at the back. We agreed to say nothing beforehand, no warnings to the family, no phone calls, no attempts to negotiate anything in advance. Patricia said it simply, let the room do the work. The night before the closing, Eleanor and I sat on the porch after dinner. The mountains had gone dark and the air had that specific quality it gets in Virginia in late summer. Thick and still and close, like the evening itself is holding its breath before something shifts. She had her cardigan on even though it wasn't cold yet. She was quiet for a long time and I didn't fill the quiet because with Eleanor silence was never empty, it was just the space she used to decide what she actually wanted to say. Eventually she said, I want you to know something before tomorrow. I turned toward her. When I drove to Patricia's office 14 months ago I was scared. I sat in that parking lot for 20 minutes before I could make myself get out of the car. I was scared that I was wrong about Greta and that I was doing something that would damage this family permanently. I was scared that I was being a suspicious old woman inventing problems where there weren't any. She paused and looked at the dark ridge in the distance. I almost drove home without going in. I told her I was glad she hadn't. She nodded slowly. So am I, she said. She reached into her cardigan pocket and pulled out her house key on the small brass ring she'd carried since before I was born, the one with the faded blue enamel tag she'd painted herself the year she moved in. She pressed it into my palm and closed my fingers around it without ceremony. That's yours now, she said. It was always going to be yours. I held the key and didn't say anything because some things land better in silence and this was one of them. We sat on the porch until the last light left the mountains and then I helped her inside and she went to bed and I sat in the kitchen for a long time looking at the key on the table in front of me, thinking about the woman who had made a 40-minute drive alone 14 months ago because she trusted herself enough to act while she still could. I was in my car by 1 o'clock the next afternoon. The folder sat on the passenger seat, certified copies of every document from the walnut box, Howard Deeks's full report, the circuit court filing confirmation, and the photographs of the two signatures printed side by side so anyone in that room could hold them in their own hands and see exactly what I had seen at Eleanor's kitchen table 3 weeks ago. Patricia met me in the lot at 2:15. Briefcase, charcoal blazer, the particular unhurried steadiness of a person who has walked into rooms like this before and knows that composure is its own kind of argument. The escrow officer was a man named Gerald Foss, methodical and careful, the kind of professional who treats every file like it might end up in front of a judge. He looked up when we came in and glanced at Patricia and paused in a way that told me he recognized her name or her firm or both. I don't have your firm listed on this transaction, he said. I represent the Eleanor M. Kellner Revocable Living Trust, Patricia said, placing her briefcase on the table. "We have documents material to this closing." Something recalibrated in Gerald Foss's expression. The kind of recalibration you see in a person who is good at their work and has just understood that the afternoon has become more complicated than the schedule suggested. Greta arrived at 2:25 with Marcus one step behind her as always. She wore a slate blazer and her hair was down, the presentation she used when she wanted to appear reasonable rather than purposeful, though the effect had always depended on what she was actually doing. She saw me before she fully cleared the doorway and stopped for just a beat, hands still on the frame, her expression running through its rapid private calculation before she stepped inside and took the chair across from me. She looked at Patricia. "Who are you?" she said. Patricia introduced herself and the trust and set the recorded deed on the table. "The property has been held in trust for 14 months, she said. "The recording is public record." Greta's jaw tightened. "There is no active trust," she said with the flat certainty of someone who has told themselves something false often enough that it started to feel like fact. Patricia did not argue the point. She simply placed the recording stamp on the deed where Gerald Foss could see it clearly. "My father came in and sat at the far end of the table and looked at the deed the way you look at something you were hoping wouldn't be exactly what it turned out to be." Don Hargrove took a seat with the pressed neutrality of a man mentally reviewing his liability. The buyer's representative, Sandra Alt from Ridgeline Property Solutions, came in last, opened her portfolio, read the room in about 4 seconds and closed it again. Patricia laid the remaining documents on the table one at a time, each one placed deliberately, each one given a moment before the next. The durable power of attorney naming me, executed 14 months prior, notarized, independently witnessed, legally sound. Dr. Sutton's capacity evaluation confirming Eleanor's full testamentary competence at the time of signing. The circuit court filing showing the active formal challenge to the April power of attorney. And last, Howard Deeks's report, centered on the table where every person in the room could read the heading. Forensic Document Examination Report. 15 measurable characteristics. Conclusion. Inconsistent with voluntary unimpaired signature. She did not read from it aloud. The silence it produced was more effective than anything she could have said. Greta picked it up. I watched her read it. I watched her set it back down on the table and look at the space in front of her with the particular stillness of someone sorting through all available responses and finding none of them adequate. Marcus was looking at his hands. My father was looking at the window again. Gerald Foss took his time. He read the trust deed against his own preliminary title report. He reviewed the court filing. He looked at the capacity letter. He set it all in a neat stack, folded his hands on top, and said in the measured voice of a professional who has arrived at the only conclusion the evidence supports, I cannot proceed with this closing. The property is held in trust. There is an active challenge to the claimed representative authority on file with the circuit court. Title cannot be cleared under these circumstances. He looked at Sandra Alt. I'd recommend your client be consulted before any further action is taken on this transaction. Sandra Alt stood, nodded once to Gerald Foss, and walked out without addressing anyone else in the room. Don Hargrove followed 30 seconds later with the careful, unhurried movements of a man who wants very much to no longer be present. Then Greta spoke. Her voice was controlled but only barely, the control of a lid on something that had been building heat for a long time. You had no right, she said. He was looking at me. This family has managed Mom's affairs for months while you made weekend visits and mistook that for responsibility. Her hands were flat on the table. Someone had to make the real decisions. I kept my voice at the level I had been practicing, quiet, even no anger in it because anger would have given her something to argue against and I wasn't interested in arguing. Someone already did, I said. Eleanor made every one of these decisions 14 months ago when she had full capacity, full information and complete freedom of choice. She chose the attorney. She chose the structure. He chose me. Everything in this folder is her decision. Made by her for herself before any of you decided to start making them on her behalf. Greta stared at me for a long moment. Then she stood, collected her folder and walked out. Marcus followed. My father sat at the end of the table a moment longer and then rose slowly and walked to the door and stopped with his hand on the frame and his back to the room. He stood that way for a few seconds without turning around. Then he left. Gerald Foss documented the closing as voided, flagged the file with the court challenge reference, and said Patricia would receive confirmation by email. We thanked him and walked out into the late afternoon, the Allegheny ridgeline catching the last gold of the day, the air carrying the cooling edge that comes to the valley at the end of summer. That went exactly as it needed to, Patricia said. I nodded. I was already thinking about Eleanor on Ridge Patch Road, the porch light on, the blue swings still, waiting for me to come through the door and tell her the house was still hers. I drove straight to Ridge Patch Road from Blue Ridge Settlement Services. Eleanor was in the kitchen when I came through the door, standing at the stove with a dish towel over her shoulder, heating soup she'd made from the last of the summer tomatoes. She heard the door and turned around and looked at my face, and that was enough. She turned the burner down and sat at the table and waited while I sat across from her and told her what had happened in order, without embellishment, the way she had always preferred to receive information. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Good." Just that one word, the same way she said everything important without decorating it. She ladled soup into 2 bowls and we ate at the kitchen table with the window open and the evening coming in off the mountains, and neither of us felt the need to say anything more about it that night. The days that followed were quieter than I expected. I had anticipated something, a phone call from Greta, a letter from an attorney, some last attempt to salvage the transaction or at least to make clear that she was not finished. What I got instead was silence, and I had enough experience with Greta by then to know that her silence meant she was regrouping rather than retreating. I was right about that. 3 weeks after the closing, Patricia called to tell me that Ridgeline Property Solutions LLC had formally withdrawn from the transaction, and that their attorney had sent a letter to Greta noting that the buyer would not be pursuing the acquisition given the title issues and the active court proceedings. The letter, which Patricia had obtained through the circuit court filing, included a line I read twice. It stated that the buyer's representative had been assured at the outset that clear title could be delivered and that the representation had proved materially inaccurate. That was the language of a business relationship being ended and a record being established in case it needed to be referenced later. Dawn Hargrove quietly removed the Ridge Patch Road listing from every platform it had appeared on, including the off-market materials. The lockbox that had been clamped to the gas meter at the side of the house was gone within a week of the closing. I only noticed its absence because Eleanor mentioned it one morning with the same mild observation she used for everything. "The box on the meter is gone," she said. I told her I'd noticed. "Good riddance," she said, and went back to her crossword. The circuit court process moved steadily over the following months. Patricia filed the formal petition to void the April power of attorney and the listing authorization Marcus had obtained at night. The grounds were threefold: the pre-existing and superseding trust documentation, the signature irregularities documented in Howard Deeks's forensic report, and Eleanor's own sworn statement that she had not understood the nature of the documents she had signed. Greta did not contest the petition. I had expected a fight, and when it didn't come I asked Patricia why. She said that contesting it would have required Greta to put her own account of the April signing on the record under oath, and that Howard Deeks's report made that a situation no attorney would advise a client to walk into voluntarily. The petition was granted without a hearing. The April power of attorney and the listing authorization were formally voided by court order in November. The Eleanor M. Kellner Revocable Living Trust was confirmed as the sole governing instrument over the Ridge Patch Road property. I was confirmed as successor trustee with full legal authority. It was done on a Tuesday, and Patricia called me at my desk to tell me, and I sat in my car in the parking garage that evening for 10 minutes just letting it settle before I drove to Covington to tell Eleanor in person. What happened to Greta after that came to me in pieces over the following year, the way information travels in families that have fractured and are no longer talking directly. The GK Holdings LLC, the shell company that had been the managing member of Ridgeline Property Solutions, was dissolved with the State Corporation Commission 6 weeks after the closing. Greta's property rental business in Harrisonburg had a difficult year. 2 of her long-term rental properties went into maintenance disputes with tenants and 1 ended up in magistrate court. I did not follow these developments closely. They were not my concern, and I had enough to occupy my attention. What I did hear through my father in one of his sparse and careful emails was that Greta had listed her own house in Harrisonburg in the spring. He did not offer context, and I did not ask for it. Some information tells you everything you need to know without elaboration. Marcus I heard about from a different direction. Eleanor's neighbor, a woman named Frances who had lived 2 doors down for 30 years and missed nothing, mentioned in passing one afternoon that she had seen Marcus at the house on Ridge Patch Road in January. Not inside, just sitting in his car at the curb for a few minutes before he drove away. He had not knocked on the door. He had not called ahead. Eleanor didn't mention it and I didn't bring it up. I thought about it for a day and then I let it go. Some people circle the thing they lost for a while before they accept that it isn't coming back. There was nothing in that to respond to. My father wrote to me 4 times over the course of that year. The emails were short, all of them 2 or 3 sentences that carried the weight of things he could not figure out how to expand into paragraphs. The first said that he understood now what had been happening and that he was sorry he hadn't seen it sooner. The second said that he had spoken to Greta about what she had done and that the conversation had not gone well and he thought I should know he had tried. The third said that he missed his mother and didn't know how to ask if he was still welcome to visit. The fourth came in December, a week before Christmas, and said only, "I was not the father I should have been to you in this. I know that." I read each of them twice and I sat with them honestly and I replied to all 4 briefly without coldness and without false warmth. I told him Eleanor would always want to see him. I did not tell him that he had done enough or that it was fine because it hadn't been, and offering comfort I didn't mean felt worse than honesty. Some distances close slowly. Some don't close at all. What I knew was that Eleanor was the one whose wishes mattered most on the question of who came through that door. And she had never stopped being his mother no matter what he had allowed to happen. He came at Christmas. He sat at the kitchen table in the house he'd grown up in and Eleanor made him coffee and they talked about small things the way people do when they are finding their way back to each other from a distance and don't want to rush it. I stayed in the living room and let them have the kitchen. It was not a resolution. It was a beginning of one, which is slower and more honest than a resolution anyway. The thing I think about most looking back is not the closing or the documents or the forged signature or any of the mechanics of what happened. Those were important and they were necessary, but they were not the thing. The thing was the 40-minute drive Eleanor made alone to Lexington 14 months before any of us thought to be worried. The thing was the phone book, the yellow notepad with handwritten questions, the pressed slacks and the pearl earrings she wore to an attorney's office because she wanted to feel like herself when she did the most important thing she would do that year. The thing was the 20 minutes she spent in the parking lot deciding whether to get out of the car and the fact that she got out anyway. Eleanor had no guarantee that her plan would work. She had no guarantee that I would find the documents or understand them or be willing to do what they asked of me. She made those decisions anyway because she knew herself and she knew what she wanted and she trusted that clarity enough to act on it while she still could. That is not a small thing. That is, in my experience, one of the rarest things there is. I moved to Covington 6 months after the closing. Not into the house, I had my own apartment on the east side of town, close enough to walk to Rich Patch Road on a good morning. I took a position at a firm in Lexington that handled estate and elder law. It was a longer commute and a lateral move professionally, and everyone I worked with in Roanoke thought I was being sentimental. Maybe I was. But I had spent 6 years processing other people's legal emergencies from a distance, and I had learned something from Eleanor about the value of being close enough to act when it matters. I was there when she needed me and I intended to stay there. On a Saturday in October, almost exactly a year after the birthday lunch where I had first noticed the appraisal note, I baked a lemon pound cake at Eleanor's kitchen table and brought sunflowers from the same farmer's market stand, and we ate on the porch with the mountains in the distance and the cardinals in the dogwood and the porch swing she had painted blue every 3 years without fail. She had her pearl earrings on, the small drops she wore when she wanted to feel like herself. She told me the cake was good but that she preferred the one from the bakery on Main Street. I told her she could bake it herself next time. He said she might. We sat on the porch until the light changed and the mountains went from green to gold to gray, and the house behind us held, the way it had always held, the way she had made sure it always would. If this story made you feel something, don't just scroll away. There are so many stories out there that never get told, and here on Confira Stories we bring them to life. So if you enjoy emotional real-life drama like this, take a second to subscribe and be part of the journey. And if you've ever been in a situation like this, or have a story of your own, share it in the comments. I read them. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.